Wakefield Zone's Paul Sykes was often regarded as one of the most notorious and most difficult prisoners during the 1970s and especially 1980s. So much so was his notoriety that he garnered respect from notable figures such as Charles Bronson, who had called him a notoriously hard man. Now, Paul Sykes was born on May 23, 1946, to parents Walter Sykes and Betty Barlow. In what was described as a difficult childhood, as an only child, Paul spent his formative years roaming around the Lupset estate. Now, according to Betty Barlow, Paul was a nice child who was polite to the neighbours, but his tendencies to lash out and strike people grew. To say he was violent from an early age would be true. Now, Paul's dad was an authoritarian figure, having spent 10 years in the army. The definition of tough love was apparent. Now, Paul Sykes was given his first pair of boxing gloves by his dad at age 4. In typical authoritarian way, Walter taught his son how to box by striking him at just 7 years old, 3 days a week, at Tuesday, Thursday and Sunday mornings. Paul was then enrolled into the Robin Hood and Thorpe Amateur Boxing Club. Now sadly, Paul Sykes was never far away from trouble. After developing a taste for drink from an early age, at just 16 years old, Paul Sykes had travelled to Germany for a fight, but he ended up at a bar and was so bladdered that he had to be carried out of the bar. And at 17 years old, Paul Sykes was firmly on the police radar for doing things like petty crime, like handling stolen goods, taking a car without consent, and also for scrapping. In a 2-year span, Paul Sykes had wrapped up a mammoth 22 offences, and he showed no regard for the law or police officers who would walk the beat. Now, the downward spiral of being sent to prison excited Paul. He described his initial time in prison as being a good memory, saying that he had a nice warm cell, all the books he could read, and there was no one shouting at him, barking orders. However, Paul Sykes could not sort through his emotions or even talk through them, or his aggression, and when prison officers would attempt to establish order, Paul Sykes would do what he knew best. He would strike the officers. And when he was a free man, he would then strike police officers and land himself back in jail. Paul Sykes spent over 20 years in jail, being shipped to 18 different prisons during his spell, over numerous one-sided scraps with other inmates and screws. He spent 10.5 years for striking screws and 10 years for striking police officers. Now, it has to be said that Paul Sykes knew nothing else. According to Paul himself, any time he got into trouble for fighting, he was always in the right in every case. Now, former prison governor Philip Wheatley, who was in charge of the whole prison, described Paul Sykes as a short-tempered lag who fought prison officers numerous times. Paul Sykes often credited his dad for becoming an expert in violence, saying, "I've been at it all my life. My dad would bash me in the face. How could your dad love you if he lets this happen to you 3 or 4 days a week?" Paul Sykes was known for many things. He was a professional boxer who challenged John Gardner for the British and Commonwealth titles in Wembley in June of 1979. This was a time when everyone thought Paul had been rehabilitated after his stints in prison and coming out due to petty robberies and violence. Sadly, it didn't last long. Paul Sykes' boxing career resulted in 6 wins, 3 losses and 1 draw. And then in 1981 he was arrested once again and sent back to jail for using his size and skills as a boxer and short temper to intimidate people as he worked as a debt collector. His sentence was increased once again when Paul decided to fight prison officers, and his sentence increased once again when inside jail he put prison workers in hospital. Now, Paul was known for drinking at least 5 pints a day for hydration. It was not uncommon for Paul to single-handedly challenge a group of men after a drink. Known for throwing punches as fast as greased lightning, Paul had been ambushed by a group of 4 men, whom had rained down blows. Now, it was reported that normal men would have crumbled under that pressure right to the ground, but Paul was not an ordinary. Still on his feet, he swung back. Each blow landed with purpose and with power. On a separate occasion, Paul had been thrown out of a pub by 4 bouncers in his hometown of Wakefield after being too drunk. Now, Paul did not take kindly to this, and he began to fight the bouncers, causing a title fight to be cancelled. Paul, or Sykesy as he was also called, went viral before viral was a real thing, after it was said that he had struck a shark. It was also said that Paul was the only man in history of mankind that swam across the Strait of Johor in order to avoid police. As I said, he also worked as a debt collector for businessman Dennis Flint, often travelling to Spain for work. Sadly, towards the end of his life, Paul Sykes was a shell of his former self, often being seen in Wakefield town centre, sitting on a bench and drinking. He was also targeted by teenagers who did not know the history of Paul Sykes. Effectively, he was the class definition of a has-been, and at age 60 in March 2007, Paul was in Pinfield Hospital in Wakefield after suffering from pneumonia and liver cirrhosis. Tragically, drinking had caught up to him, and he had died. After having a mammoth wealth, it was said that by the time Paul died, he only had a few quid to his name. Stay safe.